The canyon road had been quiet for less than a minute before the world erupted. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked down from the ridges, bright trails cutting across the dusk like claws raking the sky. Trucks lurched sideways as drivers swerved, axles grinding against stone. The convoy had rolled into a perfect kill zone, boxed by cliffs that spat fire from every angle. Machine guns rattled from hidden nests, their rhythm sharp and merciless. Over the radio came only panic, voice colliding, one shouting coordinates, another begging for cover, another lost in static. Dust swallowed the air until men could barely see the ground at their boots. The first vehicle shuddered under impact, flames licking the edges of its frame. Seals spilled into the open, scrambling for rocks that offered no protection. They shouted over one another, their words fractured, half lost to the roar of gunfire. Above them, the ridgeline pulsed with flashes. The ambush had been laid with precision, every shot tightening the trap, every volley pressing them deeper into the canyon's throat. In that chaos there was no order, no plan, only the sound of metal tearing and men trying not to drown in noise. Then came a single crack. It was not louder than the machine guns, not brighter than the rockets, but it carried. A rifle spoke once, sharp and exact, and an enemy nest fell silent. The rattle of its gun broke off mid-burst, replaced by a thin echo sliding down the cliff. For a breath, the battlefield staggered. The convoy froze, men staring upward as if the shot had come from nowhere at all. The storm of gunfire wavered. A second crack followed. Another machine gunner folded over his weapon, the barrel clattering down the rocks. The silence was only partial, but in that fraction of a moment, the men trapped below felt space open where there had been none. Radios lit with disbelief. "Who the hell just took that shot?" a voice demanded, rough with strain. Another answered without conviction, "We don't have overwatch here." They were wrong. On a high shelf of stone above the canyon, Lieutenant Erin Calloway pressed her cheek to the antique scope of her rifle. Its glass was scratched, its mount repaired more times than command found respectable, but it held steady in her grip. Her notebook was folded into her vest pocket, the paper edges softened by rain and sweat. She had already measured the distance in her mind, logged the wind in the margin of her chart, and timed the breath between shots. She did not call her position. She did not announce herself over the radio. She let the rifle speak again, the crack cutting through the roar, each report a counterpoint to chaos. Below, soldiers pressed tighter to cover, waiting, listening. Disbelief hardened into something else, something closer to hope, though none of them yet understood who had chosen to stay. The battle raged on, but now it carried a fracture. In the storm of fire, there was suddenly one voice, silencing the noise with precision. The forward base always smelled of dust and fuel, the kind of air that clung to clothes no matter how often they were washed. Inside the operations tent, light bled through canvas seams and flickered against a laminated roster board hung near the entrance. Black marker listed each call sign in neat rows, every line assigned to strike teams and reconnaissance groups. Near the bottom, in smaller print, was her name. Beside it, the words reserve asset had been circled once, then left to dry. It was a quiet kind of dismissal, visible to anyone who cared to look. Lieutenant Erin Calloway stood a few feet from the board, gloves clipped precisely to her belt, helmet bag folded at her boots. She had already checked her rifle, tightening the mount on the scope she had modified herself years before. The glass was older, its housing worn, but she trusted it in a way she never trusted the standard issue optics. She ran her thumb once across the dials, then closed her notebook. The edges of the paper were creased, the ink on its maps pressed deep from repeated notes. She refolded it carefully, as though each line mattered more than anyone else believed. Behind her, the tent filled with chatter. Pilots leaned against folding chairs, their laughter carrying over the smell of coffee. One of them tilted his chin toward her, and asked if antiques were still allowed on the range. Another muttered something about coffee runs being safer than combat slots. Erin did not respond. She had learned long ago that silence carried farther than words. Even if no one noticed at the time, her thoughts wandered to Stonehaven, the training ground where she had earned her certification. She could still hear the instructor who had studied her shooting log with a frown before handing it back. Methodical to a fault, he had said, as though the word were a weight meant to sink her. At the time, she had almost believed him. Years later, she still remembered the tone more than the words, the faint edge of pity in his voice. Now she stood alone in the tent, her movements precise where others were careless. She clipped her gloves neatly, lined her gear in order, folded her sketches until the corners matched. None of it was necessary. None of it would earn her recognition. But it was hers. A discipline built from hours when no one was watching. The officers near the briefing board moved on without her. They spoke of routes and timing, of fuel rotations and escort schedules, as though she were not standing a few steps away. Erin adjusted the strap of her rifle case and stepped back into the shadows where her absence seemed natural. She caught her reflection in a steel water jug, face half hidden, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The laminated roster board still hung in the corner, her name near the bottom, untouched. To others, it was proof of her place, the forgotten line on a list that mattered only when everything else failed. To her, it was reminder enough. Weakness in their eyes was simply preparation in another form. What they mocked as hesitation was patience. What they dismissed as overthinking was care. The truth was simple. She was last in their order, but that also meant she would be the one left when others were gone. The intelligence prep room glowed with the white light of screens, their edges flickering with static from dust caught in the wiring. Satellite feeds scrolled across the wall display, neat grids of desert and stone. To most eyes, the canyon looked like any other stretch of ground, dry and forgettable. But Lieutenant Erin Calloway kept seeing the same irregular bloom every time the thermal overlay refreshed. It was subtle, a patch of heat appearing too quickly, then fading as though someone had fired a burner just long enough to mask movement. She leaned closer, Ben Inholt, and circled the spot on her printed chart in red ink. The laminated map on the desk was already covered in her notes. Red lines traced possible firing positions. Blue marks indicated dead zones where convoys would lose sight lines, and a series of small X's marked where she believed support weapons could be hidden. The patterns formed a net, if one cared to look. But when she slid the annotated copy across the table during the briefing, the senior officer barely glanced down. "You're being too methodical again," he muttered, tapping the folder back toward her. Another officer chuckled and said that sometimes the safest place in a war zone was inside Erin Calloway's imagination. The room laughed lightly, and then moved on. She did not answer. She collected the sheet, slid it into her waterproof notebook, and clipped the elastic shut. Her silence was habit by now. Invisibility had its own discipline, a way of leaving the table without being remembered. The chatter in the prep room rose again. Predictions about convoy speed, drone overwatch, and how quickly they could push the route. No one mentioned the thermal bloom. No one mentioned the dead ground. Erin wrote it all down anyway, page after page, in a tight, even hand. Later, in her bunk, the tent walls breathed with the wind outside. She laid her notebook open across her knees, headlamp casting a small circle of yellow over the red ink. Her gloves still smelled faintly of oil from her rifle. Smudging the corners of the page as she turned it, she copied the canyon layout 3 times, each version with new lines and adjustments. She did not need to, but repetition steadied hair. Each map was a conversation with herself, a way of listening to the ground, even when no one else cared to. She thought again of the word methodical, the way instructors had spoken it like an accusation. To her, it was a promise. Methodical meant no guesswork, no illusion of certainty. It meant the patience to see what others ignored. In her head, she walked the convoy through the canyon, step by step, until the trap was unavoidable. She closed her eyes and imagined the sound of guns opening above. The chaos of trucks pinned with no cover. When she opened them again, the ink marks on the page were confirmation. At the far end of the room, someone laughed over a deck of cards. The sound drifting through the canvas, Erin shut her notebook and slid it beneath her pillow. If no one listened, she would carry the warning alone. The irony struck her even then. A quiet truth that settled heavy on her chest. She could already see the shape of what was coming, but her voice had vanished in the noise. When the convoy rolled, they would call it unforeseen. She would know better. The first rocket came in low, its trail carving a pale line through the canyon air before it smashed into the lead vehicle. The blast echoed off the cliffs, shaking stone dust from the ridges. Before the sound faded, a second rocket arced down, followed by the tearing rhythm of heavy machine guns. Fire crossed in sheets, converging from nests dug into both slopes. The convoy scattered in panic. Trucks swerved wildly, tires clawing at loose gravel. Men leaped out, diving behind boulders that barely covered them. Over the radios came a wall of noise, commands colliding with curses, voices breaking apart in fear. Above them, Lieutenant Erin Calloway had already settled into her rifle. The antique scope pressed cool against her cheek, its crosshairs steady despite the storm around her. She unfolded the field map she had tucked into her sleeve earlier and slid it flat against the rock beside her, eyes flicking once to the red lines she had drawn days before. Everything was happening as she had written, each ambush point firing exactly where she had marked an X. She shut out the memory of being ignored and focused instead on breathing, steady and deliberate. The first shot cracked. A machine gunner on the eastern ridge jerked backward, his weapon tumbling from its mount. The nest fell silent in an instant, leaving a gap in the crossfire. Below, soldiers glanced upward, startled, but could see nothing through the haze. Radios spiked with confusion. "Where did that come from?" someone barked. Another voice snapped. "We don't have support on the ridge." Erin ignored them. She adjusted, rolled her shoulder, and sighted in again. The second shot came half a breath later, precise and calm. Another gunner collapsed over his weapon, and the line of tracers sputtered out. The convoy below seized the chance, trucks grinding forward to cover, SEALs dragging the wounded out of fire lanes. For the first time since the ambush began, they had room to breathe. The enemy adjusted quickly. New bursts opened from higher along the slope, sharp angles that threatened to trap the convoy again. Erin tracked one nest, followed the glint of a barrel just long enough to mark wind, and fired. The round found its mark, and the machine gun went quiet. She shifted without pause. Each shot measured, each report carving silence out of chaos. The radios filled again, this time with disbelief shading into hope. A strained voice muttered, "Somebody's covering us." Another, younger, shouted, "Keep moving. We've got an angel on the ridge." No one named her. No one knew her face, or that she had been the line-marked reserve asset on a board they had walked past that morning. But now her competence was undeniable, written in every gap she cut open through the ambush. Dust thickened until the canyon seemed to blur. The light fractured by smoke and stone. Erin did not rush. She let the weight of each trigger pull guide her. Her scope, an anchor, while chaos raged around. Below, the convoy pulled tighter into formation. Men glanced upward with something close to reverence. In the storm of fire, one calm voice was speaking, not through a radio, but through the sharp, exact language of her rifle. The lull after Erin Calloway's first shots did not last. Fresh muzzle flashes tore across the upper ridges, brighter, sharper, and higher than before. Through the haze, She caught the heavy shapes of men dragging mortar tubes into position. The sound of metal clanking against stone carried down into the canyon, a hollow rhythm that promised destruction. If those weapons fired, the convoy would have no chance. Troops had regrouped near a bend, engineless idling, but every attempt to move forward was broken by bursts of fire. The SEALs crouched low, radios squawking in half-formed orders that contradicted one another. Erin pulled her laminated wind chart from her pocket. The plastic surface was streaked with dirt and smudged from sweat, but she smoothed it against the rock with care. A breath later she fired, catching one of the mortar crew before he could drop the first round. The others scattered, dragging their tube behind them, and the threat paused. She had bought seconds, not safety. The enemy adjusted with speed, pushing higher along the shale ridges where her angle was blocked. Erin pressed flat against the stone, rolled onto her side, and began crawling across jagged ground. Mud clung to her sleeves, scraping her uniform raw. Each movement sent grit down her collar, and once a ricochet chipped stone close enough to cut her cheek, blood welled and streaked down to her jawline. But she ignored it. She moved steadily, methodical as always, finding a new sightline through fractured rock. Below, the convoy wavered. Orders overlapped, some shouting to push forward, others to fall back. Confusion thickened until men hesitated in the open. Trapped by indecision, Erin shifted her rifle, pressed the transmit key on her radio, and let her voice cut through. "Calm. Even," she said. "Left side. Keep tight. Stay low." The words were simple, stripped of authority, yet they carried more weight than the chaos. The convoy obeyed, wheels turning as trucks ground toward the cover of a smaller canyon wall. Her shots came slower now, measured against the shifting battlefield. Each crack drove back another position, buying space for the men below. A single spent casing rolled near her boot and came to rest against the dirt. She noticed it and let the details settle into her focus. Each casing was a marker of time, a reminder that what she carried was finite. Authority did not come from rank, but from the thin line she held with every pull of the trigger. Over the radio, one voice muttered it. "Who is she?" Another answered, "Kieter. Doesn't matter. She's keeping us alive." Respect had begun to grow, reluctant but undeniable. No one announced it. No one named her. Yet every man moved when she spoke. By the time the convoy reached a tighter bend, the mortars had been forced back, and the enemy fire thinned enough for the wounded to be loaded into trucks. Erin wiped her cheek with her sleeve, smearing dirt into the cut, and slid her wind chart back into her pocket. She was not done. The ambush had shifted angles, and so had she. The truth was plain to her now, carried in the silence after each shot. Authority was never declared. It was earned, again and again, in the space between chaos and calm. The climb to the plateau had drained what little strength remained in her legs, but Lieutenant Erin Calloway did not allow herself to stop. The convoy below had stalled, pinned in the narrow retreat corridor, where the canyon tightened and offered no cover. If they tried to push without support, they would be shredded before they reached the exit. The only high ground worth holding was the rocky shelf above them, a plateau baked under the afternoon sun. By the time she crawled into position, the stone beneath her palms was so hot it seared through her gloves. Dust hung in a haze, thick enough to blur shapes. Yet the enemy fire was still precise, as if someone above was guiding every burst. She knew at once there was another sniper watching the field. She unpacked her charts, spread them flat against the rock, and marked the convoy's position. Thin red lines, smudged at the edges, showed angles of fire. Her pen scratched new notes into the margins, even as bullets snapped overhead. She circled sectors where suppressive fire could break nests, and scribbled reminders about ammunition count. By her knee, 3 magazines remained, stacked neatly like rations at the end of a long march. She touched each one with deliberate calm, measuring not just the rounds but the time they represented. The glint of glass betrayed her opponent. A faint flash cut through the haze from the opposite ridge. She shifted her rifle, pressed her cheek to the worn stock, and slid the contrast filter across her scope. The field sharpened just enough for her to trace the line of light back to its source. A sniper lay concealed, patient, waiting for her to reveal herself. It became a contest of breaths. She inhaled, exhaled, held still, and let the seconds pass until he moved first. The instant shimmer from his scope flared. She fired. The sound of her shot rolled like thunder across the plateau, and his rifle fell silent. Her lips cracked as she licked them. The canteen at her side long empty. Sweat had dried into salt crusts on her collar, but her movements remained steady. She shifted to another angle, sighting down toward a machine gun nest pinning the convoy. A squeeze of the trigger, another gap forced open. The SEALs below seized the chance to drag a wounded man into cover. Over the radio came nothing but short, clipped acknowledgments. No one knew her name, but they moved in rhythm with her fire. Exhaustion pressed harder with every passing minute. Her arms trembled when she reloaded. Though she kept her motions precise, dust rolled in waves, masking the canyon floor until she had to rely more on memory than sight. She traced her fingers over the inked map again, letting its red lines guide her. Another burst from the opposite slope pinned the lead vehicle. She steadied her rifle, fired once, and cut the angle. The convoy engines roared to life again. Men, shouting encouragement through static. By now, only one magazine remained, lying almost weightless against the stone. She stared at it briefly, not with despair, but with calculation. She had been methodical to a fault, and that discipline mattered most when there was almost nothing left. She opened her notebook, wrote 2 quick notes in the margin, then pressed her pen down until the tip carved into paper. The words would outlast the dust. The plateau became her anchor point, the thin shield that kept collapse from turning final. She endured where others could not, her presence holding the canyon together. True strength was not in the flash of a single brilliant shot, but in the grit to remain when every part of the body begged to give in. She stayed, steady behind her rifle. While the battle raged and the convoy below fought to live, the canyon exit stretched ahead like a wound in the rock, promising freedom yet threatening collapse. For the battered convoy inching toward it, the passage was more than an opening. It was survival. The last chance to escape the trap that had closed around them since the ambush began. Engines groaned as battered trucks crept forward, each carrying men slumped against the sides, bloodied but still clutching weapons. The wounded were piled into the flatbeds, some groaning softly, others silent, their faces pale in the dim light. The sun had begun its descent, staining the horizon in shades of rust and amber, and every shadow seemed to crawl with threat. On the high ridge above, Lieutenant Erin Calloway forced her exhausted body to remain still. Hours of combat had hollowed her muscles. Each movement, an effort of will. Her knees shook beneath her, and her elbows trembled against the rifle stock. Even her breath rattled, scraping through a throat raw from dust and smoke, yet her eyes never left the scope. That antique lens, scratched and worn, had steadied her through every phase of the battle, and now it was all that kept the convoy alive. She reached for her last magazine with hands that no longer moved quickly. The plastic felt heavier than it should. Her fingers numb. But she slid it home with deliberate care. The sound of the bolt sliding forward was sharp and final, a reminder that she had no more chances after this. She had written every possible scenario into her notebook, mapped every angle on her charts. But none of that mattered now. What remained was one magazine, a rifle that had already outlived its expected use, and her will to stay until the very end. The battlefield pressed closer with every second. Enemy fighters surged along the ridges, their shadows long in the dying light. Shouts carried across the canyon, punctuated by bursts of gunfire. The convoy below faltered, drivers hunching low over their wheels as rounds skipped off steel. The canyon air turned heavy with smoke and dust, choking the last rays of daylight into a red haze. Erin swallowed against the dryness in her mouth, lips cracked, tongue thick. But she kept the rifle steady. Then she saw him. A spotter crouched high on the far ridge, a radio set cradled in his hands. He spoke into the handset with calm precision, the kind of assurance that came from knowing artillery was waiting to answer. Erin had seen enough of those calls to recognize the pattern. The mortars had been scattered. But if his voice reached the battery, the convoy would never make it to the exit. Trucks that had crawled so far would be torn apart in seconds. Erin adjusted her scope, ignoring the pain screaming in her shoulder. Her vision tunneled. Not from panic, but from the absolute focus she demanded of herself. The spotter's outline was clear against the rim of the setting sun, his profile lit in gold. She closed one eye, inhaled deeply, and held the breath in her chest until time seemed to hesitate. For a moment, the battlefield disappeared. There was only her, the rifle, and the figure framed in light. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the canyon, a single report that cut clean through the layered storm of sound. The spotter fell backward, his radio tumbling from his grasp and clattering onto the rock. He never spoke again. For a breath, the entire canyon seemed to pause. Gunfire slackened. Voices faltered, and even the dust felt suspended in the last light. Then the enemy fire grew erratic, scattered without the rhythm of coordinates to guide it. The precision was gone, and with it the noose that had been closing around the convoy. Below, engines roared back to life. Trucks lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as drivers pushed hard for the exit. Men leaned out of doors and flatbeds, firing wildly at the ridges, not because they expected to hit, but because they needed to believe they could reach safety. Over the radio came a voice, hoarse and weary, almost reverent. "Whoever you are," a SEAL muttered, the words breaking in static. "We owe you." No one answered. No one asked her name. Erin lowered the rifle, her hands trembling. The barrel glowed faintly with heat, and the scope was warm against her cheek, slowly cooling as the wind shifted. She glanced down at her feet where the final casing rolled across the stone, spinning once before it came to rest in the dust. It was such a small thing. Brass against rock, yet it marked the end of everything she had carried into this fight. Her knees gave way, and she eased herself down, back pressed against the ridge. The sun slipped lower, painting the canyon walls in deep shadows. Below, the convoy pressed on, swallowed one truck at a time into the narrowing gap that led out of the kill zone. Their engines faded until only echoes remained. Erin sat alone, rifle across her lap, the weight of silence finally pressing in. She had stayed because no one else could. Stayed until the last shot was the only one that mattered. Sometimes, she thought, that was the only measure of strength that counted. The operations tent glowed with the harsh light of screens, their surfaces replaying fragments of the ambush in endless loops. Grainy drone footage showed the convoy crawling through smoke, muzzle flashes sparking from the ridges. On every replay, the same question lingered. A calm series of shots cut open paths that should not have existed, but the identity of the shooter never appeared on any log. Officers muttered at the back of the tent, "Voix low," some asking who had covered the withdrawal, others worrying about command reports that demanded neat answers. A few suggested unauthorized engagement. None spoke with certainty. In one corner, Lieutenant Erin Calloway sat apart from them, her rifle led across her lap. She ran the cloth along the barrel slowly, each stroke steady. Precise. Powder residue stained the rag black, but she continued until the metal shone again. Her movements carried no urgency. No need to prove anything. Cleaning the rifle was as much ritual as maintenance. A way to leave the battlefield behind while the tent buzzed with speculation. No one looked in her direction. No one thought to connect the quiet woman in the shadows with the ghost in the footage. On a nearby table, the mission log flickered. A line had been entered automatically during the convoy's withdrawal. Unidentified support fire. Ridge position. Possible friendly. That was all. A single vague sentence to account for the difference between survival and loss. Erin glanced at the words once, when an officer passed her screen too close. The entry did not sting. It was exactly what she expected. Outside the tent, the compound moved with its usual rhythm. Generators hummed. Their vibration, a constant undercurrent in the air. Fuel trucks rolled past, gravel crunching under their weight. The mess tent smelled faintly of reheated stew, and men laughed at tables with voices too loud, a way of drowning out the echoes of the canyon. Erin stepped through the noise, tray in hand, and found a corner seat. Few noticed her. None paused to thank her. Their eyes stayed fixed on their own groups, their own stories. She ate quietly. Each spoonful measured clasplas, the clatter of dishes around her like a distant storm she had no part in. Later, in her bunk, she packed her rucksack with the same care she had given the rifle. The waterproof notebook went in last. Its pages were filled with lines of red ink, maps and annotations that had predicted the ambush almost exactly. She paused before closing it, uncapped her pen, and wrote a single word across the final page. Stayed. She let the ink dry for a moment, then folded the cover shut. That was enough. When she left the tent, the screens were still replaying the same footage, officers still circling the same unanswered questions. The hum of the generators followed her into the night air, steady and indifferent. She adjusted the strap of her rucksack, rifle case hanging from her shoulder, and walked across the compound without anyone turning their head. Her boots clicked softly against the stone, fading quickly into the background noise. There would be no recognition, no entry in the official record that carried her name. To command, she would remain invisible, a shadow folded into the phrase, unidentified support. Yet she knew what the men in the convoy had felt in those moments of silence she carved for them. She knew the truth. The final casing had marked. Heroism did not always live in reports or medals. Sometimes it existed only in the act of staying when leaving was easier. In silence, carried forward without acknowledgement. Erin walked out of sight, unseen again, a ghost in the roster.